We begin my top 26 remaining quarterback rankings with quarterbacks that I would really avoid at all costs unless you're in a deep super flex and you need to start them to field an optimal lineup. You have Aiden O'Connell, Spencer Rattler, and Justin Herbert. Aiden O'Connell is going to be without Devontae Adams in a brutal matchup against Pittsburgh. TJ Watt can single handedly destroy an offensive game plan, and so for that reason, I would not start him if you can. Spencer Rattler, while it is a plus matchup against Tampa Bay, it's really hard to know what to expect from him. I mean, he wasn't really a highly touted rookie coming out of the draft. He didn't receive the high end draft capital. And while it is a good offensive scheme and he has playmakers around him, definitely, let's just be cautious in this first week. And Justin Herbert, he hasn't finished inside the top 20 at the quarterback position once yet this year. And he's playing Denver. That is a tough matchup. And so for that reason, I would start just about any other quarterback over him in fantasy. Quarterbacks that I have is probably mid to low end QB2s this week that I would avoid if you can, but you may need to start once again to field an optimal lineup in a super flex are Bo Nix, Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers, and Drake May. Bo Nix, it's very tough against the Chargers. I don't think there's much offensive success from the Broncos this game in general. I think Javonte Williams, if you have to play anybody from this offense, is probably the best bet. But yeah, that pass rush is very tough to deal with, and so I don't think Bo Nix is equipped with the offensive line and the playmakers around him to have a good game. Deshaun Watson has been very poor. He still does have rushing upside. He also has had a couple long touchdowns called back due to penalty. It's just until he starts playing better on a consistent basis, it's tough to have him ranked much higher. Aaron Rodgers is playing Buffalo. This is a very tough matchup. I do think that I like the playmakers around Rodgers a lot better than I like Rodgers this week. It's just I do think he throws a couple picks, and so for that reason, I don't like him as much for fantasy this week, even though I think that from a yardage perspective, he won't be the worst. Drake May is playing Houston. It is a plus matchup, and while I don't really know what to expect from him, I do like his rushing upside, and so I do think that gives him enough of a floor to feel more confident in him than some of these other quarterbacks. It's just I wouldn't expect a massive performance from him either, and I do think there are a lot of better, more safe options. Quarterbacks that I think are probably mid QB2s this week are Will Levis, Trevor Lawrence, and Joe Flacco. Will Levis is playing Indianapolis, and so that is a plus matchup. He just hasn't looked very good. I do think, though, that he has a pretty solid day on the ground, and I think he gets a rushing touchdown. I just don't think the passing efficiency is going to be very good despite the plus matchup. And I'd like to see a good game from him before projecting him to be much higher than this. Trevor Lawrence is playing Chicago. He was very good from a fantasy perspective last week, but now he's playing the Bears. And so while I do like Brian Thomas Jr. particularly this week, even in a tough matchup, Christian Kirk I think is going to be fine. And then I like Evan Ingram. I think that Trevor Lawrence is going to struggle. I think he throws a couple of interceptions. And I think that he's going to be able to survive off of total passing yardage because I think they're going to have to pass a lot in this game. But yeah, I would avoid him if you can because it's a really tough matchup. Joe Flacco, the same thing. It's a tough matchup against Tennessee. He doesn't really provide very much on the ground. And so for that reason, I think that it's going to be very tough to trust him. If I was going to play any Colts, I would really want to play Josh Downs, but I don't think this is the best game from an offensive perspective from the Colts. Quarterbacks that I think are probably mid to high end QB2s this week are Daniel Jones, Andy Dalton, Baker Mayfield, and Kirk Cousins. Daniel Jones is playing against Cincinnati. It's a very appealing matchup. Without Malik Neighbors, I do think that limits his upside, but in a plus matchup, I think he's able to take advantage of having Wan'Dale Robinson. I think Theo Johnson has a pretty solid game. I think I like the running backs more than I like Daniel Jones, though. But I do think that he gets a rushing touchdown, and I think that salvages his fantasy day. Andy Dalton is playing the Falcons. I think he gets a good amount of passing volume. I think that Xavier Legette has a pretty solid day. I think that Deontay Johnson does from a fantasy perspective. I just think that with him having to match up probably against AJ Terrell, that I don't like that for him. And so I do think that limits his total upside while still giving him a decent floor due to the volume. Baker Mayfield is playing against the Saints. It's a tough matchup. I think that he's able to find Mike Evans for a touchdown. And I think that Chris Godwin gets a good amount of volume. I think Cade Otton is also a decent play. I just think that he's going to be a little bit more limited in terms of his ceiling in such a tough matchup. Kirk Cousins is playing the Panthers. It's a great matchup. It's just without the rushing consistency. And I also don't think he's going to have another 500-yard game. I think that's probably not going to happen again, but he was great last week. It's a fantastic matchup. And so I do think that he does have a good amount of upside. I just don't think we see anywhere close to what we saw this past week. Quarterbacks that I think are probably low in QB1s this week are Justin Fields and Jared Goff. Justin Fields, I don't think is going to have a very prolific day through the air. I think that George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth suffer because of that. But I do think that he's very good on the ground in this game, and I think he gets a rushing touchdown, which is going to give him a good floor. Jared Goff is playing Dallas this week. I do think that while it is a plus matchup, I think Jahmyr Gibbs gets a rushing touchdown. I think Jared Goff throws a touchdown to Laporta, and I think that his fantasy day is boosted by total passing yardage rather than passing touchdowns. And so I think that Laporta, while he does get a touchdown, I don't think has a massive day in terms of yardage, but I think the main beneficiaries of the yardage are going to be Jahmyr Gibbs and Amon-Ra St. Brown. I also think that JMO gets a couple of chunk plays. And so I do think that he's a very strong start this week. Quarterbacks that I think are probably entrenched in the QB1 territory, but I don't think are threats particularly to be the QB1 overall this week, are Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, and Kyler Murray. Dak Prescott's playing Detroit. I think he has to throw the ball quite a bit to stay in this game. I think CeeDee Lamb is the main beneficiary of that. I think Jalen Tolbert has a respectable game. And I also think that Jake Ferguson has a pretty solid game in terms of yardage. But I do think there are a couple better options, and I don't think this is one of those crazy games, but I do think that due to total volume alone, he's going to have a pretty solid week. CJ Stroud is playing New England. I do think that Stephon Diggs has a fantastic day due to volume. I think that Tank Dell's an upside play. I think that Joe Mixon is going to have a very solid game on the ground. And so I do think that CJ Stroud is a solid play this week. I just think that without Nico Collins, we probably don't see one of those massive boom weeks. Caleb Williams is playing Jacksonville. It's a plus matchup. I think that with Caleb Williams, last week, for instance, he had a very good game. I believe he was the QB6, and that's with them taking away a rushing touchdown from him. I think that in plus matchups, Caleb Williams is a very solid play. It's just in tough matchups, I would probably avoid him. I think that the playmakers around him and his increased confidence and his ability to grow week by week is going to start showing more. And so I think he's a very good play this week, and we could see a lot more upside than I have him projected to show. Kyler Murray is playing Green Bay. I think MHJ scores a touchdown. I think that Trey McBride has a solid game in terms of total production, but I think Kyler Murray is going to feast on the ground. I think he also gets a rushing touchdown in this game. Quarterbacks that I think are decent bets to be the QB1 overall this week are Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, Jaden Daniels, and Lamar Jackson. Jalen Hurts gets everybody back. I think that while it is against Cleveland, I don't think that's the best matchup for him. I think the offense is going to be pretty efficient. I think Saquon Barkley particularly, as well as A.J. Brown, have fantastic days. And so I do think that he's a very high upside play. There's just a couple quarterbacks that have easier matchups, or just that I think are going to perform a little bit better than him. Josh Allen draws the Jets. It's terrible. However, I think that he's going to have 2 rushing touchdowns this game, and so I think that really props up his floor. I think that Dalton Kincaid has a good amount of volume. I just think that it's going to be a tough outing for James Cook, and Keon Coleman is going to get a good amount of volume. I just think that with him matching up against Sauce Gardner a good amount of the game, that it's going to be pretty tough for the pass catchers. So I do think that's going to force Josh Allen to take over the game with his legs. Joe Burrow is playing against the Giants. He's had 2 incredible weeks out of the past 3. It's a plus matchup. I think Jamar Chase eats in this game. I think T. Higgins has a pretty solid game as well. And so I really like Burrow this week. Jordan Love is playing against the Cardinals. It's a very good matchup for him. I think that Jaden Reed has a pretty good game. I think Wicks has a bit of a rebound. I think Tucker Kraft comes back to earth just a little bit, but I still think he's a pretty good tight end this week. But I think overall, Jordan Love is going to have a pretty good game. Jaden Daniels is matching up against the Ravens. I think that he's going to have a massive day on the ground. I think Terry McLaurin has a pretty good day. I think that Zach Ertz has a decent amount of volume in this game, and then Austin Eckler gets a couple of receptions. But I think Jaden Daniels on the ground is going to be where most of the production comes from. As far as Lamar Jackson, I think that he's going to hit the tight ends for a couple passes, but I think Zay Flowers is the main beneficiary this week. I think that Derrick Henry also has a pretty good game. But I think just like with Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson's going to do most of his damage on the ground. All right, so to conclude, quarterbacks that I would probably avoid at all costs if you can, unless you're in a deep super flex and really need to start one to field an optimal lineup, are Aiden O'Connell, Spencer Rattler, and Justin Herbert. Quarterbacks that I would probably avoid, I think they're going to, in general, be low in QB2s, but you may need to start them, are Bo Nix, Deshaun Watson, Aaron Rodgers, and Drake May. I'll be curious to see what Drake May does in his first career start. While it is a plus matchup, the offensive line isn't very good. He's going to have to match up against Will Anderson and Danielle Hunter, so we saw how that went for Caleb Williams, so we'll have to see how if Drake May survives this game. Quarterbacks that I think are probably mid QB2s this week are Will Levis, Trevor Lawrence, and Joe Flacco. Quarterbacks I think are probably mid to high end QB2s this week are Daniel Jones, Andy Dalton, Baker Mayfield, and Kirk Cousins. Quarterbacks that I think are probably low end QB1s this week are Justin Fields and Jared Goff. Quarterbacks that I think are firmly entrenched in QB1 territory, but I don't think are serious threats to be the QB1 overall this week, are Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud, Caleb Williams, and Kyler Murray. And then quarterbacks that I think are definite candidates to be the QB1 overall are Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Joe Burrow, Jordan Love, Jaden Daniels, and Lamar Jackson. All right, so who do I have too high on this list? Who do I have too low? Let me know below in the comment section and let me know why. With that being said, if you like what you've seen and heard in this video, feel free to like and subscribe. It's a free and easy way to support the channel and I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.